So, thinking about this topic of the board, I thought I'd start with, the sort of the beginning, which is before somebody joins your board. How did that happen? Like, how does this person join your board, and how do you get from not having a board to having a board? So at Turo, we've raised so far different rounds of funding. We've raised a total of $220 million of venture capital. We've had 4 or 5 rounds. We've met with lots of investors throughout the years, talked to many, had built good relationships with a lot, got rejected by many, ended up working with a few. I think that one of the things that you always want to think about as the CEO of your own company is this is your job number one. Someone wise told me one day that, as long as you're burning cash, CEO really stands for Cash Extraction Officer rather than Chief Executive Officer, and what my preference would have been, which is Chief Entertainment Officer. But the notion that you're very focused as a CEO, that's your job number one, is a notion that you can easily forget because you're trying to build a company, you're building the team, you're building the product, you're trying to find product market fit, especially in the early days of the company. And then when you found product market fit, you think it gets easier. In many ways, it gets harder. When you scale the business, many new topics, many new issues. But I continue to focus, throughout the last 7 years, 7.5 years now at Turo, I focus roughly 20-25% of my time on our investor relationships. And of course, primarily our existing investors, the investors that are either on our board or are part of our cap table. We have a bunch of investors that are not actually on our board, but are important supporters of the company, have invested, some of them tens of millions of dollars, and are on our cap table, but they're not actually on the board. And talking to future investors. You're never fundraising, but you're always fundraising. You're always talking to investors to build those relationships over time so that you can get a sense of who's the right investor for your company at what stage. And I think that would be job number one before even thinking about managing the board and you have someone on your board. How do you manage that board? How do you extract value out of the board? So having that in the background as job number one for the CEO of any company, I think is important, is an important reminder. And frankly, I had underestimated it when I jumped in at Turo 7.5 years ago. I was thinking initially, well, I go out and talk to investors when I need to raise some money. Sort of a transactional relationship. We have some cash needs. We're going to run out of cash at the end of the year. 3 months before we run out of cash, we're going to go talk to investors. And I found that was the worst way to raise money because when you're running out of cash, no one wants to give you any money. It's when you have a lot of money that people actually want to give you more money. So think about that and really try hard to build a roadmap for your fundraising in a similar way that you build a product roadmap or you build a marketing roadmap or you build a team roadmap. And I'd highly encourage you to take this very, very seriously. And because it's job number one. If you run out of cash, none of the rest matters. So that's job number one for CEOs of companies that are burning cash, which we continue to burn cash. So that continues to be number one role for me. So the second piece is really choosing the investor wisely. There's always been stories of dysfunctional boards or relationships that are not great between the operators, the founders, and the boards of the investors. And I think at the beginning of that relationship, you got to think about choosing the investor wisely. And it was alluded to in the previous discussion between Sri and Jeff. It's not just about the dollars or the financial terms or the valuation or the name. You're actually choosing to be in a long-term relationship with someone who's going to be sitting in your board meetings, who's going to be part of your team, And that relationship could be a very, very long-term relationship. I've had several of my board members, a couple of them, who've been on my board for now 7.5 years. That's longer than, practically longer than almost any employee or team relationships I've had at the same time in the company. I have, so the folks who co-led our Series A joined our team in 2011. And they've been on the board for now 7.5 years. So you're really getting into a relationship. This is not a transactional thing. This is a relationship that you're building with people who could be part of your story for the next 5, 10, and frankly, as companies stay private for longer, maybe even longer than 10 years. So think about that dynamic and make sure that you weigh in the person who's going to join your board with kind of the financial terms, the transactional terms of a fundraise. One thing I did with the different rounds that we ended up executing is when we had some term sheets, and we were lucky to be able to have a few term sheets for every one of our rounds of fundraising. I actually ended up spending a lot of time doing a sort of a due diligence on the board member or the potential board member that would be joining the board. In many ways, like you would be hiring someone to join your team, and you do a lot of due diligence, you get references from them, but you also do back channels on them. I went through the same process with our investors who we were considering, saying yes to and having them join our board. Of course, they were happy to provide references, but as you know, it's even more important to have your own back channel conversation. So I looked at all the ways that we intersected and called a few people that I knew that I felt I knew well enough that they would be happy to tell me what's on their mind, if there were things that could be maybe challenging to tell. And this was very important for us because we knew that similarly to bringing someone on your team, you are going to build a relationship with this board member, and you want to make sure that they have not just the dollars that they bring to the company, but also the relationship and the fit with the company. So if you haven't done that, or if you're thinking of fundraising, for your next round, as you get to that point, make sure that when you got some term sheets, make sure that you have that instinct of understanding who that person is going to be, who's going to join your board, and make sure that you have the right process to evaluate whether they're going to be a good fit or not. And we had for our Series C, we had two very good offers. One of them was actually better from a financial standpoint, from a valuation standpoint, from a general term standpoint. But I had received sort of some mixed feedback on the person who was most likely going to join the board, and compared to the second offer that we had, which was not as good. But the person that would have joined our board, was someone that we really felt very comfortable with. We felt like he really shared our vision for the future, that he was really passionate about our product, that he was going to be a great evangelist for our company and for what we're doing. And we ended up going. We had a lot of debate internally about that, and ultimately, I pushed very strongly to go with, the latter investor, and we're so happy to have him on board. And he was instrumental in helping us raise the next round because he was such a powerful evangelist of the company that, the last round that we raised, which was our biggest round, $120 million, he brought literally 3/4 of those dollars to us. And that was, thinking, about that relationship. Not just from a personal standpoint, but think about the impact that someone who's really committed to the company, who's committed to the relationship can have in basic financial terms beyond their first engagement. It's sort of thinking about, if you're building a consumer business, don't think about just the conversion event and the revenue from that session. Think about the lifetime value of the customer. We all obsess about conversion when we're building consumer app businesses. And of course, conversion is really critical. But what's even more important over time to build a sustainable business is to think about lifetime value and deliver growing cohorts of users that are spending more money or earning more money if you're a marketplace business, which is what Turo is. And we obsess about these cohorts, and we're always trying to find ways to improve the shape of the cohorts of our users. Well, similarly, with your board relationships, you want to think about a cohort, a lifetime relationship with your board members, rather than just the transaction conversion, in the first moment. So choosing wisely, I think, is really step number one, and then getting off to a healthy start, and getting off to a relationship that kind of works for both parties. Now, assuming all of this is sort of behind you, and as you've raised or you're considering raising money from Spero, I'm sure you're going to be in great hands with the Spero team, and you're going to have that amazing investor on your board. So what next? Like, how do you do this? So a couple of things that I thought, and I want to keep some time for questions because I think it's more fun to have a conversation about this. A couple of principles. The first thing is, and I think Shri and Jeff were alluding to this moments ago, but the first thing is don't sort of overpromise in your pitch. Don't make crazy promises in your pitch. You're obviously trying to sell the company. You want to raise capital. You want to be projecting confidence. You want to be projecting optimism. You want to show charts that are going to the right, up to the right, and you want to get people excited. And so there's a natural friction between doing that and then going a bit too extreme and sort of overpromising and getting off with the new investor sort of to the wrong start. Because when you've really overpromised and investor joins your board and sees that the plan doesn't seem to be, this is assuming you're sort of post-revenue and you have some metrics that you can point to, when they see that there's a disconnect between what you promised in the pitch and what is ended up happening in the reality of the day-to-day board meetings or the monthly updates, that's not going to be great. So as you think about your pitch and the plan that you're developing when you're pitching the company, you got to also understand that pitch is going to be sort of your budget. It's going to be the standard by which you're going to be evaluated by the investors coming in, as well as by future investors who might have declined, to join your round at this point, but might be interested in your company and might, look into the opportunity a year later or a couple of years later. And I think I'm very proud of what we've done with our pitches because we've tried to be obviously ambitious, but also realistic and not, have crazy numbers floating in our pitches. And and when we were trying to raise money with KP for our Series A, and they declined. We went back in our Series B and pitched KP. They also declined, but they were like, "Oh, we saw that the stuff that you said you're going to do, you're actually pretty close to what you promised you'd do." And then we went back and pitched them again in the C, and then they invested and led our Series C round. So I think thinking about building your plan and building your pitch in a way that's realistic not only gets you off to a good start with the investor that's joined your board, but actually builds credibility for you as a CEO, for your team, as you're able to execute, when you promise, you're going to deliver. And that's a lot of that trust that Jeff was talking about. Building that trust is building the trust, that the credibility that what you promise you're going to deliver. And there's always, of course, things that can change, and you've got to adapt, you got to pivot. Sometimes you got to make some radical changes. But if the plan that you promise to an investor when they join is a plan that, roughly speaking, what you execute against and not something completely different, then I think that trust is built up, and it allows you to do things with your investor that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Speaking, and then of course this becomes the cycle of performance. We now have quarterly board meetings, but a couple of years ago we still had like board meetings every 6 weeks, and you might be having board meetings every month or every 2 months. We've now switched to a quarterly board rhythm, and we have a 5th board meeting in the month of December, which is the board meeting where we talk about the following year's goal, and we update our 3-year plan. So very disciplined about the rhythm, and you got to take that pitch and then turn it into the quarterly updates and then the monthly dashboards, and it sort of all needs to flow together. We invested early in some analytics visualization tools. We were very happy to be big users of Domo since 2011 and Looker. I would highly recommend that you invest a little bit of your money and time in visualizing data and putting together dashboards. And we've just actually given our board direct access to all of these dashboards. So they can go in, they have an account, so they can look at our results and our performance on our key dashboards for our KPIs, and frankly, for whatever they want to look at on a daily basis, even on an hourly basis. The data updates every hour. And so we've created a lot of transparency with our investors that are on the board, not every investor, but with the investors that are on our board. They can go into our dashboards and look at our performance. And that gets to principle number one principle number two. Principle number one is deliver what you promise. Principle number two, no surprises. You don't want to be starting a board meeting and providing a surprise new piece of information to your board, especially in terms of performance. You want to absolutely avoid that. That breaks that trust. Why did you wait until the board meeting to tell me that we're behind our sales plan or behind our hiring plan or what have you? We've espoused that sort of extreme transparency where our board members can just go in and use their credentials to actually see how not just last month or last quarter ended up being on a whole host of metrics, but literally the performance in the last hour. And that I think has been I feel like, at least with our investor, we set a new bar, a higher bar than what they've seen with other portfolio companies. And I think that's been something that they've tried to spread to other portfolio companies, because it's great to be able to have that information and not to have any disconnect between your assessment from the last board meeting and then the next assessment for the next board meeting. You can have that calibration all the time between the operators and the investors, which is really critical to building that trust. And then the last thing that we do that I'm also proud of is that I want to talk about today is we do an annual 360 process, 360 feedback. We do an annual sort of performance review for our team. I started it when we were 10, and when we were 10 people. And I think a lot of people think, oh, this is you do this when it's a big company. You need an HR organization to do it. You need process. It doesn't sound very exciting. I completely disagree. I think you don't need HR. We only had hired our very first VP of HR a few months ago when the team was already 300 people. I think you're the head of HR as the CEO of the company until you hire somebody to run HR. And I think it was important for me to make sure that we have a culture of transparency on performance with our team, and also a culture of coaching and development with our team. But we applied that same culture with our board. So the first time in 2012, first time I asked my board to run a 360 feedback process for me, I looked at their faces and they were absolutely flabbergasted. They had never done that for any of their CEOs, never. And I told him, well, listen, you have never done it, but it's a good idea. I think I want to get feedback from my team, and I'm not going to get it if I ask them directly. So could you help shepherd this process? And we decided one of our board members was going to lead the process, and it's been a role that changes every year, so it's not the same person running it. And it doesn't have to be process heavy. It could be just an email. It was actually an email. Now we have a tool, and it's getting to be more structured. But in the early days, it was just an email that board member sent to all of my directs, as well as anyone that they wanted to connect with in the company. And they asked them, what are the things that Andre is doing well? What is he not doing well? What is he should be start doing today or for tomorrow? And so very basic questions. And that created, I think, a new level of transparency, again, for our investors that are sitting on the board, a whole new level, I think, for me, of trust and confidence that that we're on the same page, that I understand what are my perceived strengths, what are my perceived areas for improvements, that we can have a conversation, that I can get that, because I need that growth myself. I'm always trying to find ways to grow myself, and I'm not going to get that feedback if I don't run that kind of process. So those are three things that we've done with our board that I think have helped us really establish a lot of trust, a lot of colleagueship between our board members. I don't feel like they're a board member. I feel like they're part of our team. And then there's a lot of things we can talk about if you're interested about how to run an efficient board meeting and all of that, but I don't want to get into the tacticals. But if there's questions, I'm happy to talk about them. Last, before we talk about have questions, once you've established that trust and that calibration with your board, I think your job as CEO is to get them to work for you. And I do that all the time. I think that's a very important part of, I think, personally, my philosophy is, they're going to be on your board. They need to deserve their seat on your board. And it's not just the money that they bring in. It's their continuous contributions over time. So I've worked hard with every one of our board members to identify the areas that they were uniquely good at, where they had unique strengths and unique things that they can contribute to the company. And we have a sort of an annual plan for each one of them. While I don't check in with them the way I check in with our team in terms of performance metrics, et cetera, but I do, in a way that is pretty direct. Like say, okay, board member A, you're going to be helping us with this, with our independent board member hiring. So over the next quarter, I'd like you to, if you're okay with that, I'd like you to present 5 candidates for that independent board member seat, and here are the criteria that we've thought about. What do you think? So we put together sort of a brief for an independent board member, and one of our board members, who's an investor, is actually sort of in charge of running that search. And that's a relief for me because it's a lot of work to actually do this really well, and I can get leverage from my board. That's an example of something that I'm currently using our board to do. Another element that I've used, I've given sort of projects for our board was around business development. In our business, we're in the middle of a massive transformation of the transportation industry, and OEMs and traditional companies, industrials, are really a big part of that transformation. At least they could be, and I think we have an opportunity to collaborate with many of them to accelerate our own success and enable them to be successful as well. And we have one board member who's particularly connected with the automotive industry. So we charted together a strategy around, and I'm not, and no one on my team is. All of my team is techies from Silicon Valley, right? There's no much automotive experience in our team. So we leverage one of our board members, and we've been able to, leverage that board member to get introductions to practically every OEM out there. Hey, I'm running out of time. I guess I gotta. Is that the signal? All right, sorry, I'm running out of time. Anyway, this just an example. Obviously, those are examples that are unique to us, but I'm sure there are things that if you thought creatively about what could a board member do for you, and then just give them that project and make sure that they execute.
Okay, so we're gonna take two questions, and then I know Andre will be able to stay around a little bit during the break. So,
yeah.
If you have any specific questions that didn't get answered, we'll turn it on. Okay. Okay, great. So 2 questions.
Thanks so much, Andre. This was incredibly helpful. I think it's clear from your talk, like having activated, engaged board members can be super valuable. But I know for a lot of early stage companies, there's also this like existential risk you hear about, right? When a founder loses control of the board, or when board members outnumber founders. And so like at the pre-stages, the pre-seed and angel round is very common. They don't take board seats. At the A, it's very defined that a lead investor will take a board seat. At the seed, it's sort of amorphous, right? And so how do you think about the role of a seed stage investor joining your board, and kind of like when's the right time to go from just founders or company members on the board to bringing that first investor in? Like when's the right time? What's the right relationship? How do you think about that? Because if you get 2 term sheets where one firm is asking for a board seat and one's not, right? Does that play calculus or not?
I'm not worried about loss of power, or I think if everyone's on the same page, and everyone's trying to build the business, I think I see the way I perceive our board members, and in particular our financial investors, they're instrumental in helping me build the company. So I don't see that rapport, in terms of sort of balance of power, and it's because I think we've done our homework before we brought in that investor. I think if you end up with an investor that you don't feel comfortable with, or they brought you the best terms, but there was a malaise in terms of the relationship, then you might feel that way. And I just highly recommend you don't go down that path at all, because I think that's just an optimization for the short term versus the long term view of building the company.
Got it. Thank you.
So we're gonna go here.
So Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Do you have any experiences that you kind of learned from the hard way? Because it seems everything's, again, great until it's not. I mean, what would you do if one of your board members doesn't work out and you're essentially signed up with this person for a long time? Or other scenarios?
Yeah, I think it is. I think first about what I should be doing in order to make sure that it works. I take complete responsibility personally for any failure or any dysfunction that happens at the board, because it's ultimately my decision as the CEO to who I brought into this board, right? So it is something that I think if you have that mindset, and I think it's very important to have that mindset. If you have that mindset, you anticipate problems, you anticipate dysfunctions, and hopefully you can avoid them. And it's hard sometimes to have that mindset, because it's different personalities can clash, and different contexts can bring not necessarily bring the best in people. But I think if you can start with the mindset of it's your responsibility as a CEO to make sure that the board is functional, I think you would think about the issue differently than they're here and they're problematic. How do I work with that situation?
Okay, thanks.
All right.
So we're going to try to get the program back on track.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.